At this point, we've discussed a number of ways in which the brain could get access to the recommendation strengths associated with a cortical receptive field. The receptive field can be present in current sensory inputs, or it can be indirectly activated on the basis that it was active in some way in the past at the same time as a receptive field or group of receptive fields that are already active. And finally, the activity of a receptive field can be prolonged. And various types of memory have been identified, and we can now see that the different types vary in the different primary type of brain information process that supports them. Neurons and columns or other structures in the brain don't know about cognitive categories and behaviors, but they can know about correlations in their past activities. So all cognitive processes must somehow use just these types of information processes to generate cognitive behaviors. Each type of memory requires receptive fields that can support the indirect activation, and in some cases, the receptive fields must only be defined for fairly short periods. So, looking at this conceptual picture of the cortex as a whole, different cortical areas have connectivity that enable them to discriminate between different types of circumstances, or to record correlated activity by different groups of columns. The types of receptive fields are defined genetically in general terms, in terms of the areas that provide inputs to other areas and the lengths of time receptive field definitions tend to last. But with these starting points, most receptive fields are defined heuristically by experience. Sensory inputs can directly drive receptive field detections. But if this population of receptive field detections doesn't have a predominant recommendation strength in favor of the most appropriate current behavior, somehow the brain has to work towards a population that does. All the active columns have recommendation strengths in favor of indirect activations of various kinds. So a secondary active population can be generated by using some combination of those strengths. Then a second indirect activation, perhaps of a different type, generates a tertiary population, perhaps a fourth population, and a fifth, and so on. At some point, a population will be reached that does have the appropriate predominant recommendation strength. And note that there's no reason why the receptive fields detecting activity by columns active at the same time in the past can't themselves acquire externally directed recommendation strengths of various kinds. The key point is that the whole of human cognition can be understood in terms of sequences and combinations of direct detections and different types of indirect activations, plus appropriate prolongations of activity. And a little later, we'll get into how consciousness and self-awareness can be understood in these terms. But of course, a critical point in all of this is how do receptive fields acquire appropriate recommendation strengths? And we're going to discuss that in the next section on procedural memory.